Welcome everybody to the webinar Information Accessibility for People with Disability during the COVID-19 crisis. This event is part of our UNSW Disability Innovation Institute research seminar series. But this time we present it to you online, whilst we are all in the comfort of our homes. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that the UNSW Kensington campus sits on, the Gadigal and Badigal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I currently reside on, the Camaragal people. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and future, for they hold memories, traditions, culture and hopes of Indigenous Australia. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement to all Indigenous people that are present today. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices across our universities and beyond, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of the country. If audience members have any questions during the event, please click on the chat function in the top right corner with the question mark. If anyone is having any difficulty and cannot use the chat function, please email us, or if necessary, please use the number below. Please only use this number if absolutely required, so it is available for those that require it. The number is 0295 85 9114. Please see the closed captions button at the far right bottom. You will be able to turn this on and off. The webinar will be recorded and will be available following the live stream in these formats, as a recording with captions and Auslan and as transcript. The audience questions and answers will be conducted via the side panel within Teams. Please click on this button. It is in the top right corner. On the slides, there are some visual images to show exactly where the button is. In regards to social media, please feel free to join the conversation online using #UNSW, and you will see the Twitter handles here. For those listening, it is @DisabilityUNSW, @Ariela Meltzer, @CSI Social Impact, #UNSW. I would also like to say a few words about the Disability Innovation Institute, which I am very proud to be a part of. It is a world-first initiative that connects UNSW scholars, community, industry, services, government and practitioners, both nationally and internationally. Our aim is to create and share knowledge, which is interdisciplinary, innovative, and most importantly, inclusive. At the core of all we do is co-designing and co-producing knowledge together with people with disability and their organizations. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ariela Meltzer. Ariela is a research fellow at the Center for Social Impact, UNSW Sydney. She's focused on research with people with disability, young people, families, and sometimes other groups, such as social housing tenants and people who are homeless. Her key interests across these groups are role of relationships in social policy and social purpose programs, and accessibility of information for life, research and advocacy, including writing easy-read documents for UNSW research. And now, without further ado, Ariela, over to you.
Thanks, Eva, and lovely to be here talking with you all today. I'm giving this webinar from Camaragal country, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present of this country that I live and am currently working on. And I would also like to extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are here today. Today I'm going to be talking about information accessibility for people with disability during the COVID-19 crisis. I'll be talking about my insights about what accessible information has been available online during this time, and what questions the crisis raises about what good provision of accessible information means in general. I want to start by saying upfront that my talk is not aimed at detailing what accessible information should look like from a technical sense, and it is also not aimed at assessing the quality of any individual resources out there right now. Instead, it's about looking critically at what it means to provide accessible information in a fast-moving crisis. I also acknowledge that providing accessible information is a contested and sometimes difficult activity, where there are sometimes different opinions and no easy answers to complex questions about how to do it. I'm not intending for my insights to be a critique of any single provider of accessible information, and I'm not going to name any specific organisations or any specific examples of resources that I consider to be good or bad practice. Rather, I'll be asking questions and reflecting on what I hope are issues that can help the whole area move forward. Over the past few months, I've discussed some of the ideas I cover in this talk today with others who have informed my thoughts. And I would particularly like to acknowledge Jonna Lunsky, Diana Palmer, Kathy Basterfield, and Leanne Dowse, whose insights have helped shape my talk today. Thank you. Next slide, please. For me, the starting point for any consideration of information accessibility is that it's actually a human right. Article 21 of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities says that people with disability need to be able to access information and communications on an equal basis with others. This is also a right protected by the Australian Disability Discrimination Act, which says that it's unlawful to refuse to provide goods and services on the basis of disability. That presumably includes accessible information. So this means that access to information is a human right. And this is at the best of times, not even in a pandemic. Given that there's a wealth of evidence that many people with disability are at risk of severe health effects from COVID-19, this right takes on even more importance at the moment. Getting the right information is actually a matter of life and death. This is the very serious background to everything I have to say today. Next slide, please. I want to clarify at the start what I mean by information accessibility. There are a whole host of formats that are included under this umbrella. It includes information that is accessible to people with low vision, for example, that uses large text, good spacing, and sans serif fonts. It also includes information that is accessible on the internet, for example, having alternate text behind images for screen readers to read. Further, it includes information that uses easy language, so that it is easier to understand. Common formats include Easy Read and Easy English, where pictures are also present to support people's understanding of the written information. Finally, it also includes information that is translated into Auslan and information made in formats that allow communication. For example, resources for users of alternative and augmentative communication. So there are a lot of formats included, and there's no one easy answer to accessibility for everybody. This is also part of the background to what I have to say today. Next slide, please. As someone who's been interested in accessible information for a long time, in the early days of the COVID-19 crisis, I became interested in what accessible resources were out there about it. Not thinking that it would lead to anything like this webinar, I put up a tweet on the 17th of March this year. It said, "I've been keeping a list of resources about COVID-19 that I've seen that are accessible to people with disability. Info access is so important at the moment. Although most are online through various organisations already, I will post them in the thread below. Please add any I have missed. Not really thinking about it that much, I thought there would be 10, maybe 20 resources to collect. 2 and a bit months later, the number is instead around 90, or even more, way over 100, depending on the way you choose to count the resources. Further, looking at the information has made me ask a whole lot of new questions about what it even means to be accessible, which I'll talk about today. One quick note before I do that. The insights that follow in this talk were not generated in a systematic way. It's not research, at least not yet. I've not done a systematic research for all of the accessible resources available on COVID-19. And so the ones I'm talking about today are simply those that came across my social media feeds as someone who was relatively connected into the information accessibility and disability advocacy space. The main criteria that I applied in deciding what went on my list was that I would focus mainly on Australian resources, but would include those from overseas in 2 situations. The first, where they presented information relevant and not contradictory to the Australian experience, and the second, where they provided a type of resource or coverage of a topic not otherwise available in Australia. While this means that what I'm presenting today is not rigorous in the sense of being systematic research, it is probably a relatively realistic view of what a person seeking accessible information online might find. The average person is not going to do a research-like search of the whole internet. They're just not. However, they will probably be connected into a few key organisations or agencies who they know provide relevant information, and they'll end up using whatever they can find that way. In many ways, my way of compiling my list replicates this real-life experience, even though it's limited compared to systematic research. Next slide, please. So finally, after all that background, what actually are the questions that the list of resources raise for me? The first question is this: how quickly does accessible information come out compared to other information? From the time that the COVID-19 crisis really started taking off in seriousness in Australia, which was around mid-March, we were inundated with information about it. There was rolling news coverage in newspapers and the nightly news. Notifications from all services we use about safety, information from our employers, and so many others. It would make sense then that this would also be the time when accessible information started coming out too. The earliest accessible information did also start to come out in mid-March. It was mainly from a few key disability advocacy organisations and some specialist information access services. The NDIS also put out some information at this time, focusing on what COVID meant for its clients and the delivery of its services. This was all very needed and very appropriate. The information largely focused on some foundational issues that everyone was grappling with at the time. Things like, what is COVID-19? How do I keep safe? And how do I properly wash my hands? Some of the information went into greater depth from a disability perspective as well. For example, talking about safety in the context of having support workers in one's home. It was all really useful. However, with the exception of the NDIS information, all of this information was just from the community. It was not provided by government. Government branded accessible information did not come out until the end of March, almost 2 weeks after the crisis was really being considered very serious. Notably, and probably importantly for this discussion, the government was also criticised at the time for their lack of a timely public health campaign on COVID-19 in general, irrespective of whether the information was accessible. And they had a ton of things to be organising at the time with very little time to consult or get things set up. But nevertheless, more official information was available earlier from government in standard formats. That timeline really should have been the same for the accessible information, particularly in a crisis that has disproportionate impacts for people with disability. In a crisis that is escalating quickly, the timing of information really matters. Next slide, please. The next question that my list got me thinking about was which accessible formats are covered and why. My list eventually covered information in many formats: Easy Read, Easy English, Auslan, inputs for alternative and augmentative communication, easy videos, large print and braille, picture stories, and social stories. However, well over half of the information was in either Easy Read or Easy English format, and Easy Read was the format that the most separate providers of information created. The next most common was Auslan. All of the other formats only happened in a few cases in comparison and were less commonly from Australia. The question that follows is why the breakdown of information happened this way. Why are some formats more common than others? It's impossible to know the answer for sure. An optimistic assessment would say that those most commonly available is what there is more of a market or need for. However, I fear it's also about some other things as well. For example, is it also about what there is time and resources to produce, and which formats are seen to be the supposedly easy targets for claiming that inclusion and accessibility have been done? Further, is it also about which formats the social purpose sector, general public and government have been trained up to know about already? These formats are of course important and have been highlighted for a reason, but they also aren't the only ones. A thorough approach using multiple formats has never been more important than now, a time when people's lives really depend on getting the information in the format they need. Next slide, please. A third question. To what extent is accessible information kept up to date? One of the huge challenges of providing accessible information during the COVID-19 crisis has been the fast-moving nature of the crisis itself, and therefore very frequent changes to the information required. Quite often, it has seemed that as soon as one set of information is released, it's already out of date or another update is needed. I don't think that I've ever before seen new rounds of accessible or really any information be needed or come out at the speed that it has over the past 2 months. In general, the accessible information available on my list has been kept relatively up to date, although admittedly with 2 big caveats on that. Firstly, it has been kept up to date on some topics more than others. And secondly, the heavy lifting on keeping it up to date has been shouldered by some providers of accessible information more than others. This also means that some formats are more likely to have been kept up to date than others, with Easy Read, Easy English and Auslan kept the most updated, in line with having the most information available in these formats, as I spoke about earlier. My reflection on this is that the issue of keeping resources up to date is a timely challenge in information accessibility. One of the real risks of providing accessible information is that when done poorly, it can sometimes become almost a ticker box form of inclusion. All right, the accessible information's been done, now we can move on. And no one reviews the resource for a long time. High quality providers of accessible information don't do this, of course, but some others do. In the past, where the issues covered haven't been so fast moving, the lack of updates has been allowed to happen, perhaps almost by accident. But the fast moving nature of the crisis demands something more. And perhaps this is a good thing if it highlights the importance of keeping accessible information up to date in general. Next slide, please. Closely related to the issue of keeping information up to date is the next question. Is only the baseline information covered in accessible resources, or the same variety of topics that others receive? One of the things that I noticed early on in keeping my list was that a huge amount of accessible resources, particularly those ones from outlets that do not specialise in accessible information or disability advocacy, tended to cover questions like, what is COVID-19? How do I keep safe? And what should I do if I get sick? These are, of course, really important and foundational questions that everyone needs to know the answers to. But the issue is that many of the resources then did not go beyond these questions. This was at the same time as huge amounts of new rules and laws were coming out about what citizens could and could not do. It was at the same time as people were struggling with staying home so much, and as issues about grief, mental health and loneliness really started to come to the fore. It was at the same time as people had to find new ways of doing things, rearrange their schedules, live, learn and work differently, and use new resources. It was at the same time as people were losing their jobs, seeking new income support, or having their financial needs really change as the crisis deepened. The providers of accessible information who went into the most depth did start to cover some of these more detailed subtopics of COVID-19, and this was really important and beneficial. For example, those who went into the most depth covered things like the laws and rules to abide by, how different parts of the income support system interact, how to manage and cope at home, how to address mental health problems and grief, and they provided easy guides on how to use Zoom and explainers on things like personal protective equipment and face masks. These topics are really important and shouldn't be left out of the accessible information. I think the lesson is that while many accessible formats, particularly easy read and easy English, require only the key points of information to be covered in any single publication, people who use this information are still interested in many different aspects of what is happening. And it is entirely appropriate that different accessible resources are made available on the different subtopics. Otherwise, it's leaving out very key and important parts of what's happening for people who really need the information. I think the absolute pertinence of the detail to life and death in this crisis has perhaps created a new level of appreciation for the need for all the detail to be covered in accessible resources in general. Or at least I hope that's the case. Next slide, please. All of this leads to the next question, which is how and by who is accessible information produced and disseminated? In the majority of cases, provision of the accessible information on my list was done by specialist information access services and disability advocacy groups, and sometimes by service providers or groups like the NDIA. On the one hand, this actually seems very sensible, as these are presumably the organisations with the experience and expertise to produce good quality accessible information. These organisations also presumably have a readership with disability who already know them, trust them, and seek information from them on a regular basis. Therefore, they are logical places to distribute accessible information in an already scary and unsettling time. On the other hand, though, leaving the production of accessible information to these groups at a time of such critical public health messaging could also be seen as other information outlets not fulfilling their responsibilities to make their information accessible. Should news services and governments also, for example, be involved in producing accessible information, and at what scale? With the exception of Auslan translation on a few key news broadcasts, mainly of emergency announcements, and some closed captioning, there is little other accessible information from mainstream news organisations. There is some government-branded accessible information on COVID-19, but should there be more? I don't think there's a clear answer to these questions, and it's probably an area where it's not clear-cut. Obviously, the different parties need to work together to provide the whole scope of information. Nevertheless, it's interesting to think about. One final thought on this is that a few disability advocacy groups have provided hub pages of information and information triaging services since relatively early in the crisis. And more recently, a dedicated hotline and website for disability-focused accessible COVID-19 information has been created. In some cases, this work has also been requested and supported by government as part of the government's effort to provide increased information and safety to people with disability throughout the crisis. This kind of hub and information triage role, including the support for government for it, is a really important part of the answer to this question about how accessible information is produced and disseminated. It means that people don't have to search themselves for information that has been made by different groups, but can have a centralised place that is providing it to them. This in itself is part of what makes information accessible. Next slide, please. The final question I've been thinking about is who checks the accuracy and quality of accessible information? At a time when good messaging is of critical importance, it is vital that any accessible material provided to people is both accurate in its medical and social information and good quality in terms of following accessible production guidelines. For example, using proper formatting, pictures, and sufficiently easy language when making easy read information. Without being accurate and high quality, the information is less useful and at worst can confuse people or even give them the wrong information. The difficulty is that accessible information is an area that has not ever been regulated or subject to quality control checks in Australia. At the best of times, the quality of accessible information varies. This matters and is something that needs greater attention all the time, but it matters even more when people's lives depend on the accuracy and quality of the information right now. The ideal scenario would be collaboration between producers of accessible information who are well trained on how to do it on the one hand, and health experts who can check the accuracy of the medical information included on the other hand. However, this is also hard to achieve at the moment at a time when time and resources are so stretched, and it's so important to get them information out quickly. There's an inherent trade-off there. Again, this is one of the questions where there is no easy answer, except to say that when people's lives depend on it, thinking through issues of accuracy and quality is even more important. Next slide, please. That's all I have to say today, and now I want to hand over the time left for questions. The reality is that I neither produce nor rely on accessible information about COVID-19. I'm just an interested observer. I know there are many people at this webinar today who are experts in using and making accessible information, and I'm keen to understand more about what you're thinking and wondering about during this strange time. I know many of you have already been posting questions in the Q&A feature. If you haven't already, please do so now if you have things you want to ask or say. Please feel free to ask questions, but also please reflect your experiences in what you type into the box as well. I want to learn from you. Thanks for your time today, everyone.
That was wonderful, Ariella. Thank you so much for providing us with such important insights into how to develop and how to make the world more accessible for people with disability. As you rightly highlighted, it is a basic human right to have information presented in an accessible format. And in contexts such as COVID-19 crisis, it can really save lives. Thanks to you, we know how to do things a bit better. I hope we have been able to encourage you all who are listening and following this webinar to submit questions with the question and answer function within Teams live events. You can still continue to do so. It actually looks there are quite a few questions, and I want to go to first of them. This is a question from Onya. With the increasing availability of accessible information, has the quality improved, Ariella?
It's a really interesting question. Thanks, Anya. I think in general, some of the quality has improved. I think that particularly in easy read information that I specialize in, I can see that people are following some of the guidelines a bit more than they used to, which is great. There are still examples of instances where that's not the case, or instances where information has been branded as easy read, but doesn't necessarily meet the guidelines. I'm not as much of an expert in some of the other methods, so I won't comment on the quality considerations there.
Awesome, thank you, Ariella. Another question we have here is whether you could clarify the difference between easy read and easy English.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point, and I think it's one that's not understood very widely in the sector, and it's also probably one where there's different opinions on. I think that easy, there's a few different things to consider. I think the most widely understood difference between them is that probably easy English is even easier than easy read. Mm-hmm. That would be probably the difference that most people agree on. And then there are some areas that are a bit more debated. So, for example, some people would say that easy read is specifically designed for people with intellectual disability, whereas easy English might be used for any number of groups that have low literacy. But again, not all groups agree on that, and the branding of information isn't consistent. Highlighting those differences. I think this is one of the areas where there's still a lot to be worked out. In some cases, I think it's also a case of people just using different terminology to refer to information that is not too different from each other. There is a resource provided by the group Access Easy English on their website, which details in a more systematic fashion some of the differences. So the person who asked that question might refer to the Access Easy English clarification of the differences, which is set out in the table.
Thank you so much, Ariella. I better read it because I think I need to update my knowledge in this area. The third question that we have here is, and that was anonymous, who, if anyone, should have responsibility for centralizing information and also in monitoring its availability, accuracy, and quality?
The $10 billion question. I'm not sure that there's a good answer, and I guess it goes back to my slide about who checks the accuracy and quality of the information, but also the question about who produces and disseminates the information. There's probably an argument for whatever is done to be government supported, but I think having that centralisation and having that accuracy and quality check probably relies on the specialist knowledge of the specialist information access services and disability advocacy groups. So it's a good example of where collaboration would probably be required to, on the one hand, get the authority of branding it and centralising it from government, but then the specialist knowledge to actually do that from the people who do it every day.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ariella. We have here another anonymous question, and that is, how do organizations provide multiple accessible formats with limited resources?
Yeah, that's another $10 billion question. And again, I think that's probably a situation where that collaboration piece is needed. So people produce maybe a more limited set of accessible resources that they have the expertise for and that fit within their budget, but then have the capacity to collaborate with others who are providing different resources. Can you repeat the question, Eva? There was another bit in it that I wanted to address.
How do organizations provide multiple accessible formats with limited resources?
Yeah, so I think it is about collaboration. And I also think it's about looking at that centralization piece of bringing them together.
Yeah.
Building in the resourcing question from the beginning so that it's part of what the bigger organisations can do, I think is important. And I also think it's about knowing who your audience is. So I don't think that every organisation needs to do every type of resource. It's about thinking what the particular group who accesses that organisation needs. Now, obviously, for some of the big organisations where it spans more different people who need different types of information, that will be harder. Maybe those groups have more resources to produce more formats, maybe they don't. And if they don't, that's where the collaboration piece comes in.
Thank you, Ariel. We have here another anonymous question which asks, do we need to advocate for bigger policy making and legislation? Then organizations have to do it instead of being confused, as it is not against the law.
I think maybe it's about some of the policy framework around that being clearer. So going back to the beginning of my presentation, I spoke about it being part of the human rights legislation and the anti-discrimination legislation. It was interesting when I did the bit of the slide or the bit of the information about the Disability Discrimination Act, because information isn't actually specifically referenced there, but it's implied through goods and services, because providing information is a service and product of information can be considered a good. So maybe it's about the policy frameworks being more specific to actually say, you know, information is required. And if that's in there, maybe it becomes easier for the smaller organisations because it's legitimate and it's got authority behind it in that legislation.
That's a perfect point. Thank you. We have here a question from Leanne, and she's asking whether you could comment on issues of diversity around accessible information. What kinds of challenges and opportunities are there when we think about disability accessible information for Aboriginal people or for others from culturally diverse communities?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question. One of the things that I know is being considered by many of the organisations who produce accessible information is the picture sets that go with easy read and easy English information. The picture set that's considered best practice at the moment is made in the UK. And the diversity pictures that are represented there are very much the culturally diverse groups that you would have in the UK, but not here. Similarly, a lot of the branding of stuff looks like UK items. So, you know, even things like police uniforms look like a UK police uniform and we see in Australia. Pictures of ambulances look like British ambulances, not Australian. Having resources available that are specifically Australian, I think is really important so that people can see themselves represented in the information and they firstly know it applies to them and B, feels like they belong in that information because they can see pictures of their community. I know that there is some work going on producing Australian images, I think, to supplement the UK set, but I'm not sure where it's up to right now. It's been underway for a while.
Thank you so much, Ariella. We have here a question from Michelle. She's asking, even if the information has been written or produced, how will people with a disability know it is there or where to look for it? Whose job to tell them where to look?
Yeah, it's a really important question. There's a couple of ways of answering that. Part of it goes back to that question about who disseminates it, and the point that I made at the beginning of that question, of addressing that question about, you know, the role of service providers or disability advocacy groups that people already know and trust giving out that information. And so while it's important that government and news services are also involved, having those organisations involved from the disability community that are already trusted is a really important pathway of getting it to people. The other part of answering that question is thinking about issues of low literacy among many people with disability and thinking about what happens when people can't go looking for the information themselves. In addition to that, also thinking through the way the information is used. So again, drawing on my background in producing easy read information, some of the best easy read information that I've seen has included the information that is targeted to the person with intellectual disability, but also included information written in a more standard format that addresses the person's supporters or advocates, their family, their friends who might be using that information with them, with you know, not instructions, but detailed guidance on how to help the person use that resource. And I think that's a really important addition to some of the easy information that gets distributed that can help its take up in the community. And I also think it's important recognition that even when easy information, whether it's easy read or easy English, is provided in a format that is intended for people to read themselves, quite often the way it's used in the community is by supporters or advocates, family or friends, drawing on that information to get ideas about how to explain things to people with intellectual disability verbally in easy ways. You know, quite often family members will say, oh my gosh, you know, COVID-19 or any other number of complex things are so complicated, I wouldn't even know how to go about starting to explain this to this person who I care about. What can I draw on to help me think about how to explain it in an easy way? And I think that in the community, that's a realistic way that a lot of the easy resources are used. So including those kind of guidance, information documents alongside the actual accessible material, I think helps get it to the people who need the information as well.
Thank you so much, Ariella. We have here another question about the accessibility of research. So it says most of the research papers are not accessible. As researchers, should we make our published papers accessible, such as providing easy read version of research results?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I think that's something that researchers are very, very, very slowly moving towards. Some of the biggest disability journals, for example, are starting to require an easy summary at the beginning. In many cases, it's probably not easy enough, but it's a slow step in that direction. Research centres within universities who are community facing have also, in many cases, started to produce easy summaries of their information. So for example, many of the reports I've worked on at UNSW, particularly with a disability focus, include an easy read summary of their main findings as well. Making very slow progress on it. Some researchers are more tuned into it than others, but I think it's certainly something that it's important, and I hope to continue to see the university sector move towards.
Thank you so much, Ariella. I very much agree with you. Here we have a question from Alex. When writing content or information, it can be hard when working with others to convince them of the importance of making information accessible. Also, it can be quite subjective, what I think might not be accessible information or easy English. Others might think it is perfectly understandable. Do you have any tips we can help others to learn what accessible information is, and that content they are producing is not always just aimed to people like them?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things tucked away in that question. One is about increasing the increasing acknowledgement of the importance of accessible information. One of the really interesting points that you can raise to support that is even just the statistics on how many people might use it. So 1 in 5 people in Australia have some form of disability. Not everybody who has a disability will need information in accessible formats, but it starts to give a picture of potentially how many people it might involve. When you broaden it out to consider that accessible information, particularly the easy formats, are not only used by people with disability, but people who may have low literacy or non-functional literacy for any number of other reasons, that figure almost doubles. So it's something like 44% of adults in Australia have non-functional literacy, which is way higher than what a lot of people would assume. So even just highlighting the sheer number of people for whom the accessible information might be useful, I think goes one step that way. The other part of that question was about kind of knowing what actually is good quality accessible information and being able to have some judgment of what actually is accessible rather than just thinking it might be. This comes back to that question that I had at the end about whether there needs to be any checks on the accuracy and quality of the information. Obviously, instituting a checking system has its own inherent risks and isn't necessarily a good idea. But I do wonder whether some type of accreditation in producing accessible information might be useful. And what that would do would mean that the organisations who really want to specialise and do a good quality job of producing accessible information and have it as part of their core business could get that accreditation and kind of really rise to the top of what of the quality considerations there. Whereas kind of some of the organisations who would just think, oh, well, maybe we should produce a resource for our members, but it's not really part of their core business, might not go down that path. And that might start to mean that kind of less of the ad hoc resources are created, and there's more of a move towards only people who really have the skills to produce good quality accessible information doing so. You know, who makes that accreditation system, how it's administered, all of that is really complicated and I've got no idea. And, you know, it might be an impossible suggestion that I'm making here in answering this question, but there would be some benefits to it if it was administratively possible.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ariella. We have here a comment from Rachel from Council for Intellectual Disability. She says, thanks for your insights and reflection. We are certainly thinking similar things and have some same concerns about quality of information and distribution. We are now working with New South Wales Health around accuracy and quality. We are sending printed copies of information to our membership, as our understanding is that some people with intellectual disability access information online and others don't. Any tips for distribution are welcome. And I think you've partially you've answered it already because you were talking about how this can be distributed. Is there anything to add to it?
Nothing to add except that I think that the distribution of hard copies is really important and probably something that I missed in my earlier information. I think there are a lot of people who don't access the internet, particularly where there are accessibility considerations in play. And so having the hard copies is super important alongside issues of web accessibility, where the digital information also has to be accessible. That's not only for screen readers, but also for other technologies such as, for example, operating a computer through an eye gaze machine and being able to have the technology behind your websites working for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ariella. We have here anonymous question or comment. I would also say I'm suspicious of who is providing this information. As a person with a disability, I need information that I can trust. Perhaps Ariella can talk about the importance of trusted sources and what makes or builds the trust.
I think this is a really good example of the role of both specialist information access services and disability advocacy groups in producing accessible information for different reasons for each one. So I think there's trust built around the roles of specialist information access services because given that it's their whole core business, there's an understanding that they're focusing on doing it well. And I think that makes for trust in the provision of the information. The other thing that makes for trust in the provision of the information is where disability advocacy groups do it. Because those advocacy groups often help people advocate on a whole bunch of other things and, you know, have developed their standing or their street cred with people over a period of time. And then if information is distributed through them in times of crisis, then they're building on that core with their membership as well. I think that's important. Having said all of that, I still don't think it lets news services and governments off the hook in terms of providing the information. Because particularly in a crisis like right now, where things are changing so rapidly, you want to make sure that those other groups are able to keep up with the information. And so I think there's still that degree of collaboration needed, even while the trust piece is important.
Thank you, Ariella. We have here a question from Leanne, and it says people who do accessible information well often learn by experience without any formal set of capabilities or skills. If we are to imagine the perfect future for accessible information, how do we begin to properly train people? You have mentioned Ariella accreditation, but what are the kinds of skills that would be needed?
Practice. I think quite often where resources are produced from organisations that don't specialise in producing accessible information, it's probably someone who's never written one before, who has a look at a few on the internet and, you know, tries to write one themselves, which is kind of probably where the people who have developed their expertise through practice have come from. But I think acknowledging the role of that practice is important. There's also a role for checking with the people who are using the information about whether what you've produced is good quality, and taking the time to learn from what they have to say. In my production of Easy Read information for UNSW, there have certainly been instances where I thought something was accessible in the way it was produced, and then the feedback that we've had from the co-researchers or the disability advocates that we work with has been that it's not quite as accessible as I thought it was, and I've had to go back. And so learning and taking those lessons back, taking the time to consult, taking the time to do user testing, as horrible as that term is all really important in building that base of knowing how to do it.
Thank you, Ariella. We have here a question from Scott. He's just saying, just following up an earlier question on diverse groups, there is cultural accessibility and disability accessibility, and I'm thinking of some awesome materials produced by organizations like First Peoples Disabled for their community. How can these two aspects of accessibility be brought closer together?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It kind of fits in with what I was talking about in the last question about collaboration between people who specialise in producing accessible information and people who have the medical expertise. And then you've got Scott's piece of, you know, also including cultural expertise there. Consultation and drawing people from groups like First Nations who have disability experience, I think, is the key there. And again, acknowledging that trust piece of, you know, why are people seeking accessible information from particular organisations that they trust? If it's because that group also understands them from a cultural perspective, then that's really important as well, and a good example of where very specific resources may be required on the one hand, but then on the other, where more of that knowledge needs to just be embedded across all of the resources as well.
Thank you, Ariella. We have a question to wrap up with from Elizabeth. Where to from here?
Where to from here? I think there's a few things. One is organisations need to think about whether they are the right ones to be producing accessible information. The organisations who specialise in it obviously need to. Some organisations, such as what we just discussed around cultural groups, may need to also produce that information, but there may be some other groups who are currently making it where perhaps it's not their role and they need to step back. I think that the move towards bringing together different accessible resources in hub pages or information triage or dedicated hotlines is really important, and that's a step in the right direction because it helps people find the information. I think we need more guidance around how to use those resources in the community. So going back to what I said about including complementary guidelines for supporters and advocates and family members about how they might help a person to use that resource. I think there's also a need to sort out some of the questions about where the boundaries of the different formats are, and to kind of revise that list of formats that are in the public consciousness as the ones that we need to do. So Easy Read, Easy English, Auslan's in the public consciousness, but are there more? And I guess the note I'd end on is just when you see people using accessible information, particularly in circumstances where you might not have thought they would, point it out, because the more that everybody knows that accessible information is used, the more it will be recognised as something that's needed. One of my favourite places where I've seen accessible information in the past, which is non-COVID related, is in polling stations on voting day. They quite often have easy English information there. And I think having it in public view in a place where everyone needs to go by law is really great. And if there's more instances where we can put accessible information on public view, more people will know about it and more space will be made for it.
Thank you so much, Ariella. This was a fantastic presentation. I think one of the very key things that we can take from your presentation, but also from the questions and contributions of people within the Q&A section, is that how important it is that the people who will be using the accessible resources are really engaged in co-design and co-production of these materials. I think that's a very critical thing to take away, among other. Thank you to all the participants for joining. Today has been very interesting and very important presentation and discussion. The event has been recorded and this will be distributed to all of you who have registered on Eventbrite following today. There will be numerous accessible formats accessible to you: a transcript, audio recording, recording of PowerPoint, speaker and Auslan interpretation. So to stay up or to date with more events and information, please go to unsw.to/subscribe disability in one word. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Ariella, for a fantastic presentation. Big thank you to Auslan interpreters, and stay safe, everyone, and stay in touch with us. Bye.